I would like to welcome you all to the final session of our speaker series for this year. As you know, my name is Kim Nossel. I'm the director of the Center for International Defense Policy. And it's a tremendous pleasure to welcome Chris Kilford to Queen's, or back to Queen's. Chris is a fellow at the CIDP, an external fellow, based in Victoria, where he is the president of the Canadian International Council. He's a fellow here. He's also a fellow at the Conference of Defense Associations Institute in Ottawa as well, right across the country. He's had a long military career. He was commissioned in 1982, retired in 2014, and in between served in a number of different places, including in Germany and Afghanistan and Turkey. And at National Defense Headquarters, I think it's important to mention that he was part of the team that wrote the Canada First Defence Strategy, the white paper of the Conservative government, issued in 2008. Chris is going to talk to us today about Turkey and NATO. He is exceedingly well positioned to do so. From July of 2011 until August of 2014, he was Canada's defense attaché in Ankara. And so without any further ado, let me welcome Chris to the Centre and to Queen's. Thank you.
Kim. Thank you very much. Just going to move that out of the way. So the first thing you need to know is it's not all about Turkey and NATO. We're going to actually cover a lot of ground. Now, are there any Turkish folks in the audience from Turkey? Okay. You can beat me up later after the presentation. Fark etmez. This is a presentation that I've put together to give at D&D tomorrow. And I was in the neighborhood and I thought it would be great to come down here and speak at the center as well. But I give a number of presentations to different audiences. This one is about Turkey and NATO, but it really isn't. I just had to have the NATO focus for the D&D folks. We're going to explore a lot of different topics. I give separate talks on the Ottoman Empire, on the Kurds, on the attempted coup in 2016, because each of them deserves that amount of time to really know what's going on. And what I've tried to do with this one is give you the highlights. And so there will be times when I gloss over things, and if you are a Turkey expert, you'll think, but I'm going to do a bit of glossing over to try to get everything into a nice picture for you. So when you leave the room, my hope is when you leave the room and you're picking up a newspaper or you're on social media and you're reading about Erdogan or the elections in Istanbul or the situation in Syria or the issues with Kurds in Turkey and elsewhere, that you'll have a better understanding of those issues. So what I thought we would do today, and I'm going to come back to this guy in a moment, but we're going to set the scene. First of all, talk very broadly about Turkey so we're on a level playing field. How many have been to Turkey before? Okay, good. We'll have a look back in time, because as President Erdogan said the other day, you can't understand Turkey if you don't know the history. So we're going to have a look at some of that history. We'll talk about the rise of the Justice and Development Party, the AK Party, that's Erdogan's party. Turkish civil-military relations, always an interesting topic. We're going to have a look at the coup, the attempted coup in July 2016. The one that people will say on the one hand was a fake coup, on the other hand it was a real coup. Who did it? I have my opinions on that, and we'll explore some of those issues. We will talk briefly about Turkey and NATO, and then we'll look forward and then some key takeaways. Now this fellow is actually my grandfather. This is when he was about 18 years old, my father's father, and he fought at Gallipoli in November of 1915, and he survived, and he was later wounded at the Second Battle of Gaza. But in my family, because on my mother's side, a cousin was also killed and his body was never recovered. His name is on the Helles Memorial there. There was always the Middle East, always Turkey. My father would chat about his father. And I have to say, a lot of my interest in Turkey started right here when I was doing my PhD. And I was studying civil military relations, and my professor said to me, I want you to look at the Ottoman Empire. I want you to look at the period of 1950, 1960, Adnan Menderes, that particular time. So I had written a heck of a lot, not ever thinking that I would go to Turkey in any capacity. I defended my PhD dissertation here in May of 2009, and then I had a little time off, and by July I was sitting in Kabul in Afghanistan at our embassy, where I spent a year. And it was fantastic because we were trying to develop the ANA and the ANP, and I was studying civil military relations and writing reports that no one would ever read, but it was great. And the phone rang, and it was Ottawa. And they said, hey, how would you like to go to Turkey for 3 years? Well, that was an easy one for me. I said, absolutely. I came home, I learned to speak Turkish for about 6 months, and eventually made my way there. And when I arrived, it was a very interesting time. One of my first little assignments was to go down to the Syrian border. And I was standing in the Kilis refugee camp on the Syrian border with the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs folks. And they built this wonderful camp for 30,000 Syrian refugees. And they said to us, yeah, you know, we've built it, but we don't think we'll ever reach capacity. Well, they were wrong. Obviously, 4 million refugees later. But they all thought Assad was going to go. And so being there during that time, in the thick of all of that, it was just wonderful. So let's just sort of set the scene before we get started with a map of Turkey. I've put a lot of dates around and whatnot. Let me just talk about that for a moment. First of all, we're talking about a country of 80 million people. 17th or 18th largest economy in the world, so it's an important country. There are some interesting things about this country, though, because if you go there on holiday, if you go to Istanbul, or if you're in Ankara or Izmir, you'll come away, you'll think, wow, what a great country. Big buildings, it's built up, the people are great, and they are. But this is still a developing country. And that's very key for us, because we forget that sometimes. So for example, in 1992, that's when the first commercial television stations started in Turkey. 1998, up until 1998, compulsory education in Turkey only went to grade 5. That means kids were leaving school when they were 10 or 11 years old. And that means many of the supporters that you see of parties like the AK Party in Turkey in their 30s or 40s have the very basic level of education. In 1998, they introduced an 8-year system. In 2012, they introduced a 12-year system. Now, that's not to say that Turks don't go to high school and finish and go to university. They do. But for a large part of the population, especially as you move towards the east, the education was not great. And you can't compare it to our education system. It still suffers. If you look at OECD comparison tables with the rest of Europe, Turkey is always near the bottom. And one thing important to recognize, 2001, the Turkish economy collapsed in 2001. Millions lost their jobs, banks collapsed, and it took a bailout, an initial bailout of almost $24 billion US by the IMF to rescue the economy. Now bear in mind that the AK Party comes into power in 2002. We also, when we think about Turkey, say, wow, you know, it's a Muslim country. There are little divisions that we should be aware of. There are levies, there are different belief systems, but it's 99% Muslim. But we always in our minds say, yeah, that's okay, but it's secular. Well, it is secular. But let's be clear. Religion in Turkey has always been controlled by the religious Diyanet ministry. All the imams that preach are government employees. Everything they'll say on a Friday is dictated by the government. So that separation of state and church is, up for debate, let's say. Now, this is a country that we like to point fingers at for democratic deficits, but it's a country also that suffers because of its neighbors, and we need to be aware of that, because sometimes you need a little empathy when you're dealing with Turkey. Not everything is perfect, but let's have a look. For example, I was also cross-accredited to Georgia, so I spent a lot of time in Georgia. But in 2008, we had the Russian-Georgian War. In 1988 to 1994, Azerbaijan and Armenia went at each other over Nagorno-Karabakh. Fine. Azerbaijan and Turkey are very close. What that means is this border with Armenia has been closed since 1993. No one goes across it. So if you want to have a bit of an economic relationship, you have to figure out how you're going to do that. 2006, there were sanctions on Iran for its nuclear program. This is a big issue because Iran and Turkey, at the end of the day, do a lot of trading. 1980 to 88, we can't forget the Iran-Iraq war. That spilled over into Turkey in the form of refugees. We have, of course, the wars here in Iraq, the rise of ISIS. This all has spilt over into Turkey. And then more so, let's look inside Turkey. 1984, Abdullah Öcalan, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK. This is a conflict here that's probably killed around 50,000 people, displaced millions, and I can tell you, even today, right now, Turkish soldiers are dying in their 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s in this region. I was very fortunate in 2013 to have the opportunity to travel all through in this area, Shirnak, Cizre, Hakkari, Yuksikova, into the deepest areas here. I've served in Afghanistan, as you know. This is Afghanistan. This is tough. Turkish soldiers here, I'd say roughly between Kurdish guards employed by the state, police, gendarmerie, and the army, a minimum of 250,000 troops are tied down here with the PKK. It's a big issue. And of course, we have terrorist attacks that occur also in the rest of Turkey by the PKK. But it's ugly. It's very ugly down here at times. And then in 2016, we had an attempted coup, which I'll get to in a little bit. But that just kind of gives you an idea of what's going on in this country. But let's just go back. Let's take a trip back in time to the Ottoman Empire. So we have a look here. And you can see the red shows us the furthest expansion, 1699 of the empire, 1453 Constantinople falls. Twice the Ottomans tried to capture Vienna but fail. But this is the empire. And it's an empire that slowly gets chipped away at and leads us to the First World War. 1783, the first part of the Ottoman Empire, the Crimea, to be taken by Russia. And then if we move to that little red box, 1854, the Turks start loaning money from European bankers to finance the Crimean War. And they like borrowing money. So they keep borrowing, and there comes a point when they can't repay. So in 1881, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration Office sets up in the Ministry of Finance in Turkey. It's a bunch of Europeans. They're controlling the money, and from 1881 to 1914, Europeans are controlling the finances of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman debt doesn't get paid off until 1954. But then look at the rest of the empire. We have Napoleon in Egypt in 1798, 1882 the British, 1911 the Italians in what we know as Libya, 1881, and you can see how the empire is slowly chipped away at. It's the road to the First World War. Because by 1908 in Turkey, the military is at the forefront. Enver Pasha, the war minister, is in charge. The Germans and the Austro-Hungarians are making overtures to Turkey. And in the minds of the Turks, in Constantinople, If they throw their lot in with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians and they win, they'll get back everything. Everything the Italians have taken, the British in Cyprus, elsewhere, the French, they'll get it back. And that's the thinking. And as we know, it fails. They're on the losing side. And being on the losing side means that you're about to lose everything. And it's the Treaty of Sèvres that really shows us this. The Ottoman Empire, if this treaty had come into effect, was going to be reduced to the way it was in about 1390 or so in terms of size. We see that the Greeks were going to be given the European parts, Izmir, the Bosphorus, the Istanbul to Çanakkale were going to be internationalized. This was going to be an Italian area of influence, French, British. Armenia was going to take a large part of what we know as Turkey. And over here, we had the beginnings of a Kurdish state. That was the plan. It was the end, if you like, of the Ottoman Empire. Except, nobody counted on Mustafa Kemal Ataturk coming onto the scene. A very successful officer in the First World War, never lost a battle, the hero of Çanakkale of Gallipoli. And he found himself sitting in Constantinople at the end of the war with not a lot to do. He knew the Sultan. The Sultan dispatched him to the east to demobilize the armies that were there under Kazım Karabekir, because they were basically the last ones that were still intact, because the Russian front had collapsed in 1917 because of what was going on in Russia at the time. So the Turkish forces that were left here were generally in good shape, relatively speaking. And he decided that instead of looking after the demobilization of these Turkish troops, he was actually going to fight. And he was going to lead the nationalist side, retake what we know as Turkey today, and throw out the Allies. Defeat the Greeks here, turn on Constantinople, and tell the Allies to get out. And he succeeded. It's a long story. I'm glossing over a lot of facts, but he succeeded, and by 1923, the Allies had enough, and Turkey, as we know it today, came into being. And we were getting reports back here in Canada almost every day as to what was happening on the ground. And we were getting reports from this guy, Ernest Hemingway, who was hired by the Toronto Daily Star to report on what was happening on the ground in Turkey at the time. And I had a whole other talk on the Çanak affair, but we won't be able to go there today, 1922. Ataturk, as soon as he got into power, began to do a lot of important reforms. And you can see them listed here. First, most important thing he did, he made Fevzi Çakmak his chief of the general staff. Because he, being an officer in the military, was concerned about how the military might react with all of the changes he had planned. And he and his successor, İsmet İnönü, kept Çakmak as the chief of the general staff for 21 years. 21 years to make sure there were no trouble coming out of the military. You can see the Kurdish language was banned. In 1925, the fez was banned. The fez had been introduced as a form of modernized headgear. But by 1925, he felt that the fez was making Turks look backward. He introduced the Swiss Civil Code and the Italian Penal Code. And because of these massive changes he was making in civil society, there was a major attempt on his life in 1926, which he survived. Not the only one, but a major one. The Latin alphabet was adopted. Women gained the vote. And most importantly, because he died in 1938, most importantly in 1939, his successor kept Turkey out of the war. Must have been very tempting if you were in Istanbul at that time to join on the side of the Germans, because they were everywhere. The Vichy French were in Syria, as we know it. The Italians were on the islands around Turkey. The Germans had almost come around to Tbilisi in Georgia. Franz von Papen was the German ambassador at the time in Ankara. You can imagine, Churchill was flying into Turkey. Everybody was trying to get Turkey mixed up in the war, but they cleverly stayed out just until near the end when they joined in on the side of the Allies. Up until 1945-46, Turkey was a one-party state. But the pressure was on to hold democratic elections, a lot of pressure coming from the United States because of Marshall Plan assistance. So in 1946, Turkey held its first elections, but they were not free and fair. So we say the first free and fair elections in Turkey occurred in 1950. And when they did, Adnan Menderes won. And he won with big majorities. For example, in 1954, he took 57% of the vote. The conservative masses, in a way, the same people that vote for Erdogan today. So as soon as Turks had a chance to vote, express their will, in came Menderes. And in the 1957 election, Menderes went around boasting that since he'd been in power, he'd built 15,000 mosques. Now, times don't change because, you know, Erdogan they just opened that massive mosque in Istanbul, the largest one. Mosque building in Turkey, one might say, has been politicized. So the early 1950s, they were great. I mean, great years. The Council of Europe, Turkey joined in 1949, joined NATO in 1952, fought in Korea. Everything was going really well. But like anything, they began to do too much, borrow too much. The economy began to slow down. There were some agricultural downturns. As the pressure began to build and the media became more critical and the opposition became more critical, the government clamped down, closing media outlets, arresting people. And by 1958, we had our first indications that the military or elements of the military were thinking of overthrowing the government. And in 1960, we had a coup. Okay. And we had a coup. And we had a coup that led to some horrible things. And we just saw a picture of Adnan Menderes, and here he is, executed by the armed forces in 1961, along with his finance minister and his foreign minister, on charges of corruption and a long list of other things. But this coup was not carried out by the actual armed forces writ large. It was a faction within the armed forces. A group of about 38 military officers who planned in secret and in the middle of the night went on the radio, told the nation that they had taken over. It was very close as to whether it would succeed or not, but it did. And afterwards, it was incredibly messy. The first thing they did, the leaders of the coup, was they sacked 90% of the generals, most of the colonels, most of the lieutenant colonels. It was a complete clear out. So when people talk to me about the 2016 coup and they say, oh, the Turkish military, how are they going to respond? You know, so many people have been arrested. I always say, don't worry about it because they're used to it. It happens quite frequently. And there are many, many other examples of wholesale purges, but this was a large one. And we saw what happened afterwards. In the aftermath, the 38 officers that were in charge of the coup, some of them wanted to return to civilian rule as quickly as possible. Others wanted to have a dictatorship. There were 14 of them, and they were purged. They were sent overseas as military attachés to get them out of the country. But that still didn't stop things. In 1962 and 1963, there were counter coups led by factions of the armed forces that failed. So this was a very, very messy period in Turkish history. And it was followed by many more such periods. The best that could happen usually in Turkish politics is that we ended up with coalition governments that didn't work well together. And it led to a lot of economic mismanagement. So in 1971, the military were fed up again, and they simply wrote to the Prime Minister Süleyman Demirel and said, sort it out or else. And so he resigned. That was simple. and a new government came into place. But by 1980, with violence on the left and the right building in Turkey, the military stood back for a while, but then decided to intervene in a complete full operation run by the Turkish General Staff. And 3 years of military rule followed. And it was also a very difficult period. I compare what Erdogan does now, which is not very good at all in Turkey, to this period also, which was far worse, considering the Turkish population at the time was 40 million, not 80 million. So when you do the stats, this is something. 650,000 arrested, soccer stadiums taken over so everybody could be shuffled into them and held, 517 sentenced to death, 50 executed, no headscarves in the public sphere, lots of restrictions on the media, all political parties banned. This was a difficult period. Eventually, Turgut Özal comes in with a civilian government, and we try to make things work. Life goes on again, but in 1997, the military decided they were going to intervene. We had at that time Necmettin Erbakan in charge, the Islamist Welfare Party. He was thinking of introducing Sharia law. The military was not happy, and again they served him with a memorandum with 18 demands that he wouldn't agree to, and he was forced to resign, and a new government formed, a coalition government. Several coalition governments followed. It was a mess. I mentioned the economy in 2001 collapsing, and that's what happened. And the IMF steps in. And eventually we see the beginnings of the AK Party under Tayyip Erdogan and Abdullah Gül, who now are in charge. And here he is, the guy that everybody likes to talk about. Prime Minister, now President Erdogan. And those early years when the AK Party came in, things were looking pretty good. A lot of talk about joining the European Union. Many, many reforms were taking place. Turkey actually bought into, as I say, his ideas for the future. There was a reach out to the PKK to put a stop to the fighting. These are all dangerous areas. If you're reaching out to the PKK, you're butting up against Turkish nationalists that you'll find in the MHP, one of the main political parties in Turkey, and the CHP. People don't like it. This has been an ugly period in Turkey's history. So any reach out is going to be very dangerous and very, very delicate. The European Union piece, easy, a lot of hope. It's disappeared now. But let's just say that those early years were good years. And I don't know how Erdogan actually survived during this particular period, because they came into power in November 2002, and shortly after they came into power, the president had to go on a trip to Europe, and the Speaker of the House came to the airport to say farewell. It was a thing that was done, still is. But he came with his wife, and his wife was wearing a headscarf. And for the military, this was just too much. So you can imagine the Speaker of the Turkish Parliament is in his office, and the heads of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the General Staff come into his office. They sit down for 3 minutes and stare at him. And then they leave, and the media are waiting. I can't imagine this happening in a country like ours, but that's what happened. Huge amounts of pressure. In April 2007, Abdullah Gül, who was over here with his wife, the AK Party wanted to have Abdullah Gül as president of Turkey. And the military was opposed because his wife wore a headscarf. And so they basically told Erdogan, look, if you do it, the same thing is going to happen that happened in 1971 and 1997. We're going to force you out. What he did was called national elections earlier, won a large majority, and felt comfortable enough to move forward, and Abdullah Gül became president. In 2011, because of trials of Turkish officers over coup plotting, which was later proved to be not the case, but trials were happening and people were going to jail, all four of the commanders, the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, and the Chief of the General Staff resigned at the same time, sending a message to the government that they were not happy. And then, of course, in July 2016, we had the coup attempt. Now, as an aside, things like child marriage in Turkey are still a problem, still an issue. It's much better than it was, but it's still an issue. But it was very hard to discuss when Abdullah Gül was president, because when he was 30 years old, he married his wife, who was 15 at the time. So it was not something that you could discuss. So you had to ignore it. But I have to say, things have improved, but there's a long way to go. I want to talk about the coup. I'll tell you, I was at home on the 15th of July, working from home. I went for a run, and it was lunch, and I jumped in the shower, and I got out of the shower, and I was dripping wet, and my phone rang, and I thought, oh, who's this? You know, I better answer it. It's my home phone. I picked it up, and it was my friend Don, and Don said, Chris, there's a coup in Turkey. And he knows I'm a Turkey guy, and I said, come on, what do you want? What do you really want? He said, no, there's a coup now. I said, oh my God, my heart was racing. I put the phone down, I'm drying off. The other phone, my cell phone rings, and it was CTV. And CTV said, there's a coup in Turkey. And I said, yes, I know. And they said, can you come on now? And I, no, I can't. But I spent about 9 hours that day doing some TV coverage for CTV, and it was just wild, absolutely wild. Who did it? There was a point when Erdogan had fled the country, according to the media. The Turkish military had taken over. Nobody knew what was really going on. And I was there saying, well, we've got to be careful with these things, because if the military does come into power, it's not always the best. We didn't know for a while, but later on, here he is. He managed to get onto FaceTime. Ironic, because in a way, the Turkish government has clamped down on media a lot. But here he was. He got onto television. He said, I'm all right. I'm here. It's just a group of guys. It's not the entire armed forces. And this was probably one of the main turning points. And eventually, as we know, the coup failed. I just want to make sure I didn't skip over a slide. I didn't. So this coup failed. And why did it fail? Well, first of all, it was a coup that started 6 hours ahead of time. The coup plotters wanted to start at 3 a.m. on Saturday, the 16th of July. And one of them had gotten over to the CSIS equivalent, MIT in Turkey, and said, there's going to be a coup. And of course, I didn't believe him at the time, because as far as we were all concerned, the military was firmly under the thumb of the government. So there's no way in the world the military is going to be doing any kind of coup. But he said, no, I'm part of it, I'm telling you it's true. Now, of course, there's a lot of running about and phone calls being made, and eventually the coup plotters are aware that they better start now. Now, if you've ever been involved in a coup, and I don't think you have, it's a very dangerous game, because your life is on the line. If it goes well, fine. If it fails, you're in deep trouble. So now, as soon as you see parts of your group, and it's all been very secretive, you see parts moving, but not at the assigned time, and if you're not getting any sort of messaging, you're going to say, wait a minute, what's going on? They're starting now? We're not supposed to start for 6 hours. The coup plotters started to message all of the units involved, but it didn't go so well, to the point that at 3 a.m. in the morning on a Saturday morning, when we knew that the coup was over, there were still elements of the coup organization executing their initial plans, taking over sites at the assigned time, because they didn't get the message that they should have been starting 6 hours earlier. Troops struggled to reach their objectives. When you're in Istanbul on a Friday night trying to get to your objectives, and the traffic is horrible, And you can hear them on the radio. They've got recordings and they've got transcripts screaming to their commanders that they can't get to the objectives on time. You've got majors saying, I can't, sir, I can't do it. And he's being told, just kill people. Get them out, kill them. 250 killed, 251, 2,200 wounded. The first time in Turkish coup history that we see the Turkish military killing their fellow citizens. And you have to understand, when the people came out onto the streets, when this coup was taking place, they had no idea who was behind it, right? They just said, the military's on the streets, we're coming out onto the streets. Yes, they were called out onto the streets, but they didn't know if it was the Turkish general staff doing it or a group within inside. They didn't have any idea. They came out and they were killed. Leading government figures were not captured. Mainstream media, social media, you can see here all of these reasons why. But what the coup did is it gave a perfect opportunity for Erdogan, and I should have mentioned this before, to go after the followers of Fethullah Gulen. Fethullah Gulen is a Turkish cleric. He's been in the United States since 1999. He has a huge following around the world, millions in Turkey, and for the longest period, he was working with President Erdogan in the country, helping him secure power. Because Gulenists are some of the most highly educated, forward-thinking Turks you will ever meet. And Erdogan relied on them when he came into power to run much of the government. And they made their way up into the system, into the police forces and so on, and became very influential. But by 2012, these two began to have policy differences. It was like a political party breaking apart. For example, he was trying to reach out to the PKK. Fethullah Gulen was not that interested. He was getting fed up with EU negotiations. Gulen was still interested in pursuing that relationship. There was differences over policy vis-a-vis Syria and the Arab Spring. So there was a clash. And so what we saw was that in December 2013, Gulenists inside the government were able to show that there was massive corruption at the highest levels of the Turkish government. And 3 cabinet ministers were forced to resign. That's an entire other story. But let's just say it shook him at the roots. And he responded in kind by closing down Gulenist media outlets and schools and other facilities, businesses. He went after them as well. It was an all-out war between these two, and it culminated in the coup, July 2016, when it was elements within the military, skipped over them, who led a coup. And this is the aftermath of a coup. This is what it looks like when you don't succeed. This is General Akin Öztürk, who was the commander of the Turkish Air Forces, a 4-star. He was at this point on the National Security Council, and he was the one that we believe to have been the ringleader of the coup itself. And it was an extensive coup with a lot of resources behind it. 325 generals and admirals in the Turkish military, 167 were sacked. Many of them were sacked because as the coup was unfolding, they sort of went, oh, a coup? Let's just go over here and see how it all plays out, okay? They didn't want to get involved. And afterwards, once they were investigating what was going on, they discovered that a lot of them were sitting on the fence when they should have been out there fighting those who were behind the coup, and they weren't. But it was a real mess, and these guys are still, many of them still on trial, even after a couple of years. Now, as for NATO and Turkey, we get through all of this stuff with the coup, and the question is, what's going to happen now with the relationship going forward? Because we know that after the coup, Turkey clamped down heavily on the Gulen movement. They arrested 150,000 people. Some 30 to 60,000 are still in jail. They're still arresting people. If you're in the Turkish military today, I don't know how you go to work every day. because hundreds still get arrested. You'll hear about pickups of 50 officers here, 100 officers here, as they do their intelligence work and still find Gulen supporters within the military ranks. But needless to say, life does go on, and the relationship with NATO is still there. It's still strong. We have a Canadian commander in Baghdad looking after the training of Iraqi military personnel. The second in command is Turkish. And we can see that there are a number of NATO installations all around the country that are still functioning. Now, the Turkish military itself has had some pressure up on it. Because of the purges, it's a little smaller than it used to be. But it still depends on conscripts who serve for 12 months. And avoiding military service in Turkey is a cottage industry. And every Turk should be a soldier, we know that. But believe me, there are a lot of folks that seek to avoid doing any kind of military service because it's dangerous. It's dangerous. Their budget, $20 billion, it's about 1.6% of GDP. The problems we face right now is the whole business with the acquisition of the S-400 Russian air defense system. I'll talk about that in just a second. Right after the coup, even though the Turkish military had been devastated by all of the arrests and whatnot, within about a month they were engaged in Operation Euphrates Shield, clearing out ISIS pockets across the border. 69 soldiers were killed, 220 wounded. And then a little later on, they conducted olive branch against the Kurdish YPG. 54 were killed and so forth. So even so, and they were able to still keep fighting. This is a picture from about a week ago with 4 dead soldiers killed by the PKK inside Turkey. So the military, you can imagine, coup, loads of arrests, people still getting arrested. We're fighting over here. We're fighting here. We're trying to control this pocket of Syrian opposition in Idlib. This is a big issue. This is a military, if I can say anything, that's under tremendous pressure every single day. And this is probably the most bothersome thing that they have on their plate right now. It's the American support to the Syrian Kurds, the YPG. Because we kind of go, well, the PKK over here is a terrorist organization, but these guys, the Syrian Kurds, they're okay. But as far as the Turks are concerned, these are one and the same. And you know what? If you give a weapon to anybody in that region, it'll go anywhere. And I tend to agree with the Turks on this one. But it made sense for us to support the Syrian Kurds. Now, we've got a nice dividing line here between the Kurds and the Syrian government forces. That relationship with the Syrian Kurds and the Syrian government forces is actually very close. So even in 2014, when I was looking across the border, you would see the Syrian government flag and the Kurdish YPG flag side by side. So that's still a very close relationship, even though we've got green and blue on the map. But the fact that the Americans support the YPG drives the Turks absolutely mad. And even more when we see the YPG parading and they've got a big picture of Abdullah Öcalan on their flag. And of course, Öcalan still is the leader of the PKK. He's been in Turkish custody since 1999, and he's in a prison just near Istanbul. So you can imagine when the Americans say, no, there's no relationship, it's fine, and then they walk out with their flags, the Turks go, well, look, seriously, you know. What does it all mean in the end? Well, all those hopes of joining the European Union have basically flown away. And here's a little, well, it's a little thing, but this was on big posters during Brexit in the UK. And it said, watch out, 78 million or 76 million Turks are about to join the European Union. It was used as a scare tactic so that people would vote against staying in the European Union. Of course, if you're Turkish, you're seeing this. And that's one of the biggest insults you could ever imagine. So Standard & Poor's, Fitch, and the other ratings agencies The Turkish economy is under a lot of pressure right now, and much of its credit is junk status. When I was there, the lira was $2 for 1 lira. Now it's 4. And the economy has become so problematic that for the first time, we now see government-run vegetable stands so that you can go as a Turkish citizen and buy vegetables without buying them at the supermarket, so they're cheaper. Interest rates around 26%, inflation around 20%. We're watching a Turkey that was a massive tourist destination. 200,000 Canadians visited in 2013. It's now down to about 80,000. It goes for everyone else. So everything that's been happening in the region has spilled over and it's hit the Turkish tourist industry. 2011, Erdogan's the greatest thing since sliced bread, a model for the rest of the Middle East. By 2018, he's a dictator. And that's how he's now seen. This is the current Turkish parliament. The AK party has a majority with their colleagues, the MHP. If you're Turkish, and I've mentioned the YPG, if you're Turkish and you read this from January 2019, if Turkey gets in our way, we'll devastate we will devastate the Turkish economy. Now imagine if you're in Ankara and you're reading this tweet, and you know the Americans are supporting an organization that you consider to be a terrorist organization. This is not going to go over well in Ankara. You shoot down a Russian jet fighter in 2015. In 2016, the Russian ambassador is shot dead while he's giving a talk, shot in the back by a Turkish policeman. Can you imagine what this does for relations with Russia? But then we see this turn to the Russians to buy the S-400 missile system, which NATO is going absolutely berserk over because they don't want the Turks to have that system and have the F-35. I'm surprised the Russians would sell a NATO country the S-400. That's another issue. But it looks like they will, but this has caused a breakdown in the relationship with the United States as well. And you're probably wondering, why is there a baby pram in the middle? Because that's all to do with the Kurds. Because last year, for the first time in Turkish history, the replacement rate, the birth rate fell below replacement levels. 1.8 per family, children per family. But in the Kurdish areas in the southeast, and of course Kurds live all over Turkey and there's intermarriage, but in the provinces that are mainly Kurdish, the birth rate is around 4.5. So when we do the charts, it shows that towards the end of this century, the Kurds, if things go along as they are, will be the majority in Turkey. And that's why Erdogan, if you pay attention to Turkey, and I know you guys do, called on Turkish women to have at least 3 or maybe 5 children and do it now. So there's always a reason behind things. At the end, though, the story is that this is a country under a lot of pressure. Key takeaways, last 2 slides. Russia and Iran are important for Turkey. We can never forget that. We can't be dismissive of it. It is challenging to work with Turkey in NATO. They often oppose what NATO wants to do for a variety of reasons. But it's easier, I think, as I say here, to work with them as part of NATO than to have them outside of NATO. And of course, if they were to leave NATO, Russia would be the main beneficiary. Key takeaways for us: Turkey is not the Ottoman Empire. Although, if you were to visit Turkey today, you might think it is becoming the Ottoman Empire again. A base in Qatar, a base in Oman, a base in Sudan. Even the architecture is Ottomanesque. If you were to visit Erdogan, you would find him on an official function surrounded with soldiers dressed in Ottoman period uniforms. There's this nostalgia on television for this world, a time when Turkey, the empire, was great. And sometimes, though, they get into imperial overreach that has backfired on them in many ways. The relationship with the West it's still there. Most of the foreign investment coming in is European. Large populations of Turks in Europe as well. And about 75% of the economy is focused towards Europe. But as I've said earlier, it's in economic trouble. It faces security challenges. The Kurdish minority is a factor that needs to be talked about. The military is in real turmoil. We can't gloss over this. The lads put on their uniforms, they go to work, but this is a military in great turmoil. Before the coup, I would talk in Turkey, I would be giving this talk, similar lines, and I would say, what do Turkish military officers spend 95% of their time doing? And people would say, well, I don't know, Chris, what do they do for 95% of their time? I say they do this. They do this, constantly looking over their shoulders as to where they stand and who might be up to something. And at the end of the day, there's not a lot we can do. And this is my last slide. This is what the Secretary General had to say a couple of days ago. It's an important ally. It still is. This is Ataturk's mausoleum, where he's revered in Turkey. This is a country in a lot of trouble. The government has done some awful things, and perhaps we'll have a little time to discuss that. Thank you. Done. I have a question.
I think it's been extremely accurate. Last time I read your first paper after your first presentation here, I was amazed with your information about Turkey. I left Turkey in 1978. I have a grandfather, two-star during the war, Second World War, grandpa. He was elected 1950 and 53 again from the Democrat Party. So I also have to confess, only one person in the room, Alan Whiteman, will know. At university, I did my first degree in Turkey. I worked with Öcalan.
Did you?
I did, yes. Well, different factions. Mausoleum. So I have one piece of information you may or may not know. My Ladino friends, these are Jews from Istanbul. They say he's from us.
Ataturk?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know how it played out over the 100 years thereafter. Two questions. You just glossed over the 2007 coup.
Yeah.
Second question, you didn't tell us what you expect to happen after the municipal elections.
Right, thank you for that. And I did gloss over a lot, just because of time, because every one of these is very nuanced. But so this is an important point. The municipal elections are fought like national elections. So cities and towns and villages vote along party lines. It's a real indication of where the Turkish government currently sits. And now you have to see the AK Party controls literally all of the media and has tremendous financial resources. So you would expect at the city levels and the town levels for them to easily win any kind of election for mayor of a major city. And they didn't this time around. Izmir always goes to the opposition, CHP, but they lost Ankara and they lost Istanbul. It's the first time in 25 years that they lost Istanbul. They could have lived with Ankara going over to the opposition, but living with Istanbul going over to the opposition was too much. It's a source of income for the party and the builders and all those who get contracts from city authorities, etc. And so what's recently happened is, well, in the last few days, is that they're now going to rerun that election because the opposition won with a very slim majority of votes. And according to the government, it didn't reflect the will of the people, which is code for we didn't win. For investors, it's a real problem because they were looking at these elections as a sign that democracy was still alive in Turkey. And when we now see an attempt to overturn the election, well, it makes investors very worried. And we know the Turkish economy is weak. How can this possibly turn out now? Both sides are energized to have as many voters come out as possible. Ekrem İmamoğlu, who is the winner in the election, well, if you look at his Twitter feeds and other social media feeds, they've ballooned in the number of followers, unbelievably so. But you can bet that the AK Party will try to mobilize as many voters as they possibly can. If they win, it is not going to look good at all. It will be a Pyrrhic victory at the end of the day. And if the opposition wins, it'll be a sure sign that the AK Party's fortunes are on the decline. We've already had aspects of this in the June 2015 national elections, which were quickly rerun in November when the AK Party failed to get a majority. So these elections were very, very critical for the state of democracy in Turkey, and we've seen Erdogan through his various levers step in, and it's not a good sign. Wow, because I glossed over so much.
Can I
Yeah, well, I'll go to the back here.
follow up to what you just
Okay,
said?
sure.
2015, you did not mention that he triggered the war with Kurds
Yeah,
to run the November election.
yeah. You know, this is great. The only reason I was able to get into Hakkari and to Yüksekova in 2013 is because the government and the PKK had begun to seek a way out of this mess that they were in, a peaceful solution. And I went there as a guest of the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And and I'm the military attaché, right? But our embassy is small, and they knew I had an interest in Turkish issues. So the ambassador said, yeah, off you go. And I had that chance to go. Very rare. We thought things were going really well. And then we had the elections in June 2015. The only way to win was to start a war. And that's what happened. And the fighting with the PKK after July of 2015 ramped up to levels that we have not seen for decades. It was awful. Parts of Diyarbakir and Cizre I just visited were flattened by the Turkish military. So as I've said in my talk, it's really, really ugly. And I do apologize for glossing over the fine details, but because I know you're an expert on Turkey. But yeah, I was already getting over my time limit. So
Alan, you have the last question.
It was a very thoughtful presentation. You covered a lot of ground on a very complex topic. My question really relates to your listing of the achievements of Ataturk.
yes. Oh, Ataturk, yeah.
And it comes back to the Kurdish question. You list mostly positive attributes.
Yes.
But when we talk about Ataturk, we also have to talk about the persecution, the mass deportation, and killing of Kurds,
Yes.
particularly in the Dersim in the 1930s. So maybe in the future, you may want to put one line in about that.
Yeah, I could certainly do that, and you're absolutely right. A lot of the reforms that were introduced by Ataturk never really got outside of the main city centers. So much of the people in the East were unaffected by what was happening, and if you stood in his way, you were in deep trouble, as the Communist Party found out when most of them were drowned in the Black Sea. So it was a brutal period, and as others have said, Erdogan's worst excesses cannot match the excesses of the secularists under the rule of Ataturk and the armed forces. So I think the other thing that I didn't mention, and I think that is important to quickly mention, is that a few years ago we could point to the way President Erdogan and the way the Turkish government was going, and we could point at them and say there's a democratic deficit. But what we're finding now in places like the United States and Hungary and Poland is that they're beginning to match closer and closer the way Erdogan is performing. So it gets a little harder to say, hey, because he can turn around and say, well, you're doing the same thing in the European Union. You're closing media outlets. You're after the media. You're acting the same way. So this tide of populism, this is another talk obviously, is making him look, not so bad, but we have to be careful. We can't be dismissive of the way things are in Turkey. There are lots of journalists in jail. People are afraid to even make Facebook posts, and you can't go on Wikipedia because it's been banned for over a year. So there are issues.
On that, let me thank you very much indeed for this presentation. Please join me in thanking Chris.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Right.
And thank you all for coming this year. It's been, I think, a very good year, a wonderful way to end it, and look forward to seeing you in September. Take care.
Thanks.